1742. Okay, so we're really moving up in the ranks. And a French. You guys know, those of you who've been around for a while, which line I like to play against the French. Name it in Peter's honor. So I play e5. It's traditionally called the Steinitz variation. And in this position, who can tell me what move I am a big fan of? Knight f3. Yeah, knight f3. Okay, so our opponent basically pre-moves bishop d7 thinking that we're going to play c3, but we're actually not. And I looked at this position a little bit, and if we really want to take it to black here, okay, there's a couple of ways that we can play this, but the traditional idea here is to play bishop d3. That's essentially how we position our pieces. I'll show you some other alternatives after the game. And the point of the Steinitz is that you leave the pawn on d4. You don't play c3 at all. You just conserve time on that move, and you make all of the normal French moves except you don't play c3. You give up this pawn, which is captured. And the whole system revolves around this e5 pawn, and we need to overprotect it. We need to really defend it with everything that we've got. And then eventually, as you might remember, we tend to recover this pawn by getting the knight from d2 to b3. But before we play knight bd2, it's a good idea to go bishop f4 and overprotect the pawn so that we don't have to worry about it. Queen b6. And another important property of the Steinitz variation is that we, like, for example, here, I think some of you might want to play b3, but that's a really bad move because we want the b3 square for our knight, and your instinct here should not be to defend the pawn on b2. What should we do instead? How should we proceed? We shouldn't defend it at all. You have to realize that if black captures on b2, we're going to be able to play rook b1, and because black is so poorly developed, opening up the b file will result in total disaster for black. We don't even have to calculate this move. It's just intuitively going to be really, really bad. So we go knight bd2 anyway, and then we go knight b3, rook e1, we make all of the standard moves, and eventually we go after the d4 pawn. But we're in no rush to capture it. It's not poisoned per se. It's not like I've calculated the win. Knight b4, okay, that's a good move. But it doesn't fundamentally change our approach. We're fine giving away this bishop. So in this system, it's actually okay to give this bishop away. It's not ideal, but we can survive without the bishop. And our opponent continues to abandon their kingside development, so this can potentially be costly if this continues for very long. What's up, Mr. Feingold? Okay, so what do we take with? Well, in the name of opening up, first of all, queen takes d3 loses to bishop b5, so from that perspective, we have to play cd. But in addition, we would play cd anyway, because we've opened the c file potentially for a rook. So far, our opponent, I have to say, is playing really, really well. Rook c8. Okay, so this is a good example of where I wouldn't necessarily rush to take on d4. I mean, we can play knight b takes d4. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think it might be worth contesting the c file first. So let's go rook c1 first, and then this pawn on d4 is not going anywhere. We're going to capture it at our leisure. Okay, knight e7. Yeah. Good stuff by our opponent. Okay, so now I think it's a good opportunity to take the pawn on d4. The question is, which knight do we take with? Which knight do we take with? Oh, am I loud? I'm loud, sorry. I leaned in by accident. Sorry about that. Yeah, sorry, that was my bad. I'm sorry. So we can play knight f takes d4, or we can play knight b takes d4. So we're going to take with the f knight. We're going to take with the f knight. And, okay, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, this knight on b3 can potentially jump into c5 and apply queenside pressure. In addition, I'm thinking ahead to something that we can do on the king side, which is that if we drop our bishop back to e3, which I think we're going to do right now, I think we're going to do that right now, what potential kingside plan can you indicate that, you know, potentially gives us nice play? I'm not saying we're going to do that on the next move or anything like that. It's just something to consider. Yeah, so moving the f pawn, pushing f4, f5 could potentially be something to think about. So we're pinning, I mean, we're X-raying the queen right now. We have a nice position. And we've got control over the central squares. Yeah, I'm also struggling a little bit. If knight takes c5, I think we have a really sexy move, though. If black plays knight takes c5, we have a really, really cool discovery. Can anybody indicate this square to me? Gets it. Knight c6. We put our own knight on c6. Queen is attacked, as is the knight. So knight takes e5. We play knight c6. Okay, queen a6. Queen a6. That's an interesting move. So now I think black is threatening knight takes c5. Now we need to react to that. Now I think we need to react to that. Yeah, we can play f4. We can play f4. But I think the simpler thing is to take on c6. I think now is the time to take on c6. Is knight c5 possible? Yeah, knight c5 was also possible. It was an interesting move. These types of positions, there's going to be a lot of options. You should just realize that. This is one of those, like, I don't know how to define it. Maybe one day when I'll write a book, I'll think of different categorizations. This is one of those positions where it's like there's usually going to be 3 or 4 possibilities on every move, and they're all going to be approximately equivalent. And these are hard positions to play. How do I decide? I mean, knight takes c6 is just simple, right? What's the simplest way to deal with knight takes e5? Well, I think it's just to trade knights. This also just gives us another tempo, right? This gives us another tempo. And our other knight could potentially go to d4 if necessary, or to c5. But it's like that paradox about the... Looks like our opponent might forfeit. Nope, now he's reconnected. It's like that paradox about the animal who looks at two, or like the horse or whatever, who looks at 2 hay fields that look identical. You know, the horse is never going to choose because there's no reason to make one decision over another. You just eventually have to use your intuition and make a decision. So again, we have many options. a2 is hanging. It's not the pawn that we have to defend. I mean, we can sacrifice it if we find something compelling. We can sacrifice it if we find something compelling. And I think I have found something relatively compelling. You know what I like here? Yeah, again, I mean, even I'm struggling to make a decision here. We've got knight d4, knight c5. So many different moves. Thank you all, Devil Chicken. But let's play it simple. Let's put this other knight on d4. Let's just start by bringing our knight into the center. Now, you might be looking at this and saying, I don't understand what the heck I'm intending after queen takes a2. I'll open you in on a secret. I don't actually know exactly what I want to do after queen takes a2, but I'm getting the sense that taking that pawn with the bishop still not developed is... This is where my intuition is firing and saying my intuitive neuron is just saying, okay, there's just no way that black should be able to get away with this. And I actually think that white has a very simple and very powerful move here. I'm going to give you a hint. This move threatens to trap the queen. This move threatens to trap black's queen. And it also connects the rook. So it's also a load-bearing, helpful move. Not b3, guys. b3 doesn't threaten to trap the queen because rook a1, there is still the b2 square. We need to actually defend the b2 pawn. So let's think logically. Why does rook a1 not trap the queen? Well, it's because of queen takes b2. But playing b3 doesn't actually cover the b2 square. The problem isn't that the pawn is hanging, it's that the b2 square is accessible to the black queen. So I'm thinking of either queen e2 or queen d2. How do we decide between those two moves? Well, I'm actually going to play queen e2, which I'm positive is not what most people are thinking. And the reason I want to keep the queen on e2 is because in the event that the bishop moves away from f8, I want to be able to reposition the queen onto g4 in order to hit the g7 pawn. Does that make sense? Now here, we can win the pawn back by playing rook a1, so that's one possibility, but we don't have to. We can also play f4, which is what I want to do. We can play f4 and start going after black's kingside, trying to punish black for not having developed his or her bishop, right? And by the time black gets the bishop out, we're already going to have our pawn in f5, and does anybody really care about this a2 pawn? Does that really materially impact the course of the game, at least for the next 20 moves? No, right? It doesn't. We just push our f pawn and you know, we enjoy our life. Now, this guy is definitely, you know, I would say underrated, but I think we still have a great position. Okay, so now what should we do? Well, we've got options. We can play f6, but the simplest, I think, is just to take on e6 and open up as many files and avenues on the king side as possible and just take twice on e6 and essentially force the rook to move. And now we've restored material equality. Okay, there is an annoying move, bishop d7 in this position. But already I'm thinking of various sacrifices. So what do I see when I look at this position? Well, one thing I notice is that the rook on c8 is undefended. So in the event that the pawn on g7 disappears, I'm looking at various forking ideas like queen g4. Damn. I'm also looking at a really interesting sacrifice. Oh man, I think I see something really cool. I think we can just hammer away at black's king position. This is what's called a demolition sacrifice. We sacrifice a piece in order to demolish the pawn structure, the pawn cover around the king. And now we use our remaining pieces to blast through. Now we have a really, really nice follow-up here. Now you might say, well, is it queen g4 check? No, it's not, because that's hanging. So one possibility is to go queen h5. I'm positive that some of you are thinking of that move. And I think that's a great move, but I think we have an even better move. Now, if you look at how you can even access the king, what are the various avenues through which you can access the king? One of the things you might notice is that you can do it from d4, right? We can play bishop d4. Now, the problem with bishop d4 is that it's a little too slow. You give black a chance to play bishop e6 and blockade the pawn. So you always have to think about inverting the move order, right? An idea doesn't work. You think, what if I play the second move first? That leads you to e6, clearing the path for the bishop. And and now we play bishop d4 check, and it's actually just checkmate on the next move, basically. This was a very nice attack, and it was a very quick attack, right? It was, if we consider f4 to be the start of the attack, it really only took 7 moves. We broke open the center and the king side, and then we crashed through. This was nice. And queen takes e6 is literally checkmate. It's not even like, it's literally mate. Okay, cool. That was a nice game. So again, I'm not going to delve too deeply into the opening intricacies of the Steinitz variation because I've had previous speedrun games where I spell this out very deeply. Bishop d7 is possible. And here again, you can transpose into the advanced French main line with c3. But we decided to preserve the integrity of the Steinitz variation, bishop d3. The one thing I'll point out, I think some of you might look at this and say, well, aren't you afraid of c4? And the answer is no. Actually, c4 benefits white. And why is that true? Well, that's true conceptually because what is the point of black's entire play in the advanced French? Why is black doing what he's doing? Well, it's to attack the d4 pawn. Everything that black generally does in the main line of the advance is to attack the d4 pawn. So by baiting c4, we're taking the pressure off of d4. We're investing 2 tempi, big whoop. Right? Bishop d3, bishop b2. We spent 1 tempo, the center is closed. But now we can fully divert our efforts to playing on the king side. Now, it's not as simple as I'm describing it. I don't think c4 is actually a bad move because black gets a lot of development, and this is not to suggest that white is an easy time attacking the king side. But at the very least, we don't have to worry about the pressure on this pawn. That's the conceptual underpinning of that. And in general, I think a lot of people are very reluctant to like go forward and then go back, but that's a totally normal part of chess at a high level. Okay, so knight c6 castles. Our opponent finally takes on d4, transposing into one of the main lines. So we played bishop f4. You can also play rook e1. I saw some of you were proposing that. Rook e1 is a viable alternative. Maybe even a better move. I think I confused stuff a little bit here. Because bishop f4 does allow queen b6, aiming at the pawn. So knight bd2, knight b4. I'm actually seeing one game here. 22-11 against 1985, you can see, from opening Explorer. So takes, we're still following that game. And here in that game, black played knight e7. No, it's not drush. No, it's way too early. Just because the center is closed doesn't mean that both sides of the board are closed. So now I think we made an important decision after rook c8. So first of all, notice that we're not rushing with knight takes d4 because that pawn's not going anywhere. And then notice which knight we took with. This knight f takes d4 decision was very, very important because we paved the way for the pawn to move forward later on in the game. And we keep this knight on b3 in order to have the capacity to jump to c5. Does that make sense? So knight c6, we go bishop b3. We hold on to our d4 square. And now knight takes c5 would have been met with knight c6. Brilliant move. So the knight is protected, which means that queen takes c6 doesn't work. The queen is hanging, which means that taking with the other pieces doesn't work. The only spot that the queen can move to in order to keep the knight protected is c7. But now it walks into another x-ray, and we can take on a7, winning the exchange on c8 and winning the game shortly thereafter. No, knight f3 is the Steinitz. e5 is just the advance. So knight takes e5 is no good. But by the way, notice that even if you had missed this, even if you play something very straightforward like takes, and queen h5, I would argue that white's position is still, practically speaking, much better. Just because of the attacking potential and the fact that black's kingside is undeveloped. So when you're 1700, you need to start getting comfortable. I've talked about this before. You need to get comfortable with the concept of positional sacrifice, where you give up a pawn or even more to get this long-term positional pressure. You also have to be comfortable with the concept of, so I don't know how to there's a name for this. It's where you sacrifice a pawn or sometimes a knight in order to get a long-term attack, right? Not every attack is the same. Some attacks are very concentrated, right? Like our attack in the game was very specific to the king side. It was a very clearly defined start and end point. But some positions are just like, and it's the initiative, I guess. But it's not exactly the initiative. Let's call it the initiative for the sake of brevity. So you can think of it as the initiative. This is what it means to have the initiative. It means to have this position where you've got an attack, but the attack isn't really confined to one part of the board. You've just got pressure everywhere. Maybe your opponent has a hard time developing. And judging that those positions are good for you is an important part of growing as a player. And not being afraid to give up a pawn in order to get such a position, which is what we did here. That's why I was so easily able to sacrifice on a2, because it's a very small price to pay for a situation in which we're dominating on all sides of the board. Well, again, I think some of you, like loyalty, some of you ask questions like, well, how do I know that a positional sacrifice is good? I don't, right? Any question of the form, how do I know that a move is good? If I could tell you, then we'd all be Magnus Carlsen. Another good example, if black had played bishop c5 here, who can tell me a very powerful attacking continuation for white? Not knight b3, because if bishop takes e3, check. Not knight takes c6, because this allows a bunch of trades, which is in black's favor, because black is up a pawn. The move is rook takes c5. Now, again, it's a question of is there a good discovery? The answer is yes, knight takes c6. And why is this so good? Because the queen has to move. It's a double attack against the queen. Just like a double check, this means the queen has to move. And now we just start collecting. Knight takes g7. And this position is a phenomenal example of what I'm talking about. So some of you might look at this and say, I don't understand. Like, I'm down in exchange. What do I do? Panic. But white actually should play very calmly here. You could just drop your knight back to f5, and white is totally crushing here. It might take 5 moves, it might take 7 moves, but one way or another, white has so many ways to approach black's king. And black is so passive and uncoordinated that you know for a fact that white has overwhelming compensation. Does that make sense? And this should make sense to everybody. You should be able to look at this position and say, I can see, at the very least, why white has full compensation for the pawn. So that was a nice line. Our opponent played bishop b4, allowing f5. And at this point, I think the attack is overwhelming. Maybe bishop d7 should have been considered by black, but then we take on e6 and play queen g4, and again, black's position starts falling apart here. So after castles, yeah, we just play f takes c6. This is a very simple attack. Knight takes c6. Now we get the f file. And of course, seeing knight takes g7 is, this is an advanced tactical idea. Knight g7, e6, and bishop d4. But once I play it on the board, I think everybody understands it. I think largely knight takes g7 you can find intuitively. You can play knight takes g7 without seeing e6. I'm also positive that queen h5 is at the very least good for white. Probably even winning. What does the eval bar say about this position? Well, I can guarantee you that it's already winning after knight takes g7. We can check. We can check what the eval bar says. Oh, it's pretty good. Okay, so let's see. So basically, we can fast forward. Knight c6. Knight d4 is good. Queen e2. It's saying queen h5 even is better. Provoking g6 and then just sort of worming our way into these weak dark squares. Okay, queen e2 is fine. f4. Oh, bishop d7 was best. See, black had to play bishop d7 to discourage f5. Bishop d, but not an easy move to play. Again, black had to stave off the development of the king side. And once this happens, yeah, knight g7 is good. And e6 is good. But notice that queen h5 is +8. But those are the only two moves. You have to find one of these two moves. If you play bishop d4, after bishop e6, black is already winning. White has no continuation of the attack. Yeah, and this is already, you can see it's +11. It's totally winning. And it's basically mating. Are you more comfortable sacrificing because these players are weaker than you? Well, not necessarily. I'm just trying to play the position. I'm not necessarily thinking about who my opponent is. What if queen f2? So queen f2, there's rook f8. And remember that the bishop defends the rook. So queen g3 check, the king hides on h8, and white has no follow-up. What if the king moves forward after the bishop check? So if the king moves forward, then queen takes e6 check. And there's a million ways to mate, but you can, ladder mate is fine. h3, king g, for example, this. There's a gazillion different mates. Yes, obviously I'd play the same seconds, man. Guys, you realize that I'm trying to make the best move? I'm not playing the opponent, I'm playing the pieces. Knight takes g7 to me is a pretty elementary sacrifice. All right, it's not like I'm playing Magnus, so I'm saying, of course, to some degree, if I was playing Magnus, maybe I would make slightly different decisions. I'm not claiming that I'm going to play exactly the same way. But most attacking moves, and moves that I think are best, I'm going to play them against anybody. So this is a sacrifice. Sacrifices are made for different reasons, and the whole realm of sacrifice is often misunderstood. People think of it as this one monolith, but you can sacrifice for very different reasons. And this sacrifice is made in order to open up the king. It's sort of the most classic, like when you think of the word sacrifice, this is what you think of, like opening up the king so that your other pieces can pick up the slack. What if the king doesn't take the sack? Well, technically rook f8 is the best move, but it doesn't change anything. We still play e6 and we still crash through here. Lol, Ben. Yeah, I'm fighting an uphill battle here. And just because it's Magnus, I would beat anybody in this position. This is already completely winning. So, yeah, there's nothing black can do about it either. The best move here apparently is rook c7. Lol. That's a pretty big sign that things are going downhill for black. Any questions about this before we end? Because after knight g7, e6, the game is over. And again, if the bishop doesn't take the pawn, it doesn't actually change anything. We still have this mating attack. Ben has a question. What is the eval for the position you showed earlier with rook takes c5? So you're asking about this. The eval it's going to be winning for white. It's +3. Okay, knight f5 is probably not best, but it's still winning. You can see it's +4. The best move is even e6 here, just crashing through and leaving the knight on g7. Thank you, Ben. See, this is the ultimate seal of approval. So, any questions, guys, about this game? Anywhere. I'm just going back and forth to jog people's memory. Did you play the second? Karen is the only person I probably wouldn't play it against. I'd be too scared. Yeah, well, I've succumbed. We'll go back to life. Okay, Egg Protein asks an interesting question. When do you... intuition versus calculation is one of the most complicated topics in all of chess. Like, deciding when you have to calculate something and when you go for it. By definition, because we're talking about intuition, there is no answer to that. If you could, it's a catch-22. If you could explain why you think something intuitively, like that literally is contradictory to the very notion of intuition. Intuition literally means you cannot explain why you think so. So you can't, there's no cheat code, right? Developing your intuition happens in parallel to all of the other things that you do. Like your intuition gets better as a result of pattern recognition, and you look at more games and you know more ideas. And it's a judgment call often, like when you just say F it and you go for it versus when you spend 5 minutes calculating. a lot of you guys are looking for this algorithm, like tell me when I need to, how do I know when to calculate versus when to not calculate. You're looking for like a 2-sentence answer, like this is what needs to be the case, this is how you know. But there is no such like rule or algorithm. That's what makes this hard. So anyway, sorry for the rant, but I think this is an important topic. Well, I'm trying to give a rough guide. That's why I'm doing the speedrun. That's why I'm like, all of this is meant to serve as a rough guide for these kinds of questions. Chess is hard. You guys chose a pretty hard game to get good at. Sorry. And failed attacks are a normal part of chess, right? You're going to have failed attacks. You're going to look like a fool sometimes. You're going to sack a bunch of pieces and nothing's going to work. I've had many of those games myself. I can probably find some if I looked. Games where I just like sack everything, especially in Blitz, this happens. You sack a bunch of pieces and then you over sacrifice. Okay, I'm looking right now. I had a funny game one time. Yeah, I sacked like 2 rooks and I literally won the game because my opponent blundered up 2 rooks. This is a really funny game. I got completely outplayed and then I started sacrificing everything. And it only worked because I got lucky as hell. I'll finish with that game. Okay, so basically, you can see I'm 2100. I'm playing an 1895 before move 1. I played sort of a French setup, which is totally not... I played very badly. Like, I played DC4, which is stupid. And then he sacks a pawn. Actually, the guy played really well. Like, he totally outplays me. I'm much worse already because of this terrible pawn on c6. And it just keeps getting worse. I mean, look at my position, all these weaknesses. And so I decide at this point, all right, I'm just going to go for it. And now I start accumulating pieces on the king side. And in this position, I mean, look at my bishop. I just decide I'm going to go Naroditsky style. Knight takes h3. GH, rook takes h3. Rook fe1. My opponent defends very well. Rook f8, blundering into another fork. And now I give up the rook. I don't even take the knight back. And in this position, I'm down a rook and a bishop, and I have no attack. Like, there is literally not even a single check. I played one last try, bishop b7. Praying. My opponent takes on h3, so I'm down 2 full rooks here. And had my opponent played king e2, I would have resigned immediately. Literally, I would have extended my hand, because there is one more check. And there are no... I mean, I guess there's one more check, but that's it. What do you think he played here? He plays queen g2. And this actually happened. When he played it, I remember thinking, like, this has to be a dream. There's no way he actually played that, especially after I played bishop b7. Yeah, bishop a6 check. He was also very nice about it. He was just, like, smiling and stuff. So I would have been throwing every electronic device that I owned. He played too quickly. He played it in like 2 seconds. And this was game in 45. So I guess technically it was rapid, but it was a rated tournament. Yeah, he played it quickly. What electronic devices did you own in 2007? I mean, a computer and a mouse. The same that I own now, except a phone. Wasn't that long ago. Anyways, guys, that was just a good example. I mean, not exactly on topic, but you get the point. Okay, guys, I'm going to go to bed. I'm really, really out of sorts today. Sorry for the mediocre play. And that's about it. Thank you, folks. Thanks for the support. Hope you enjoyed the speedrun game. Thanks for hanging out, everybody. Later.